The wind never stops on these islands. It comes off the North Atlantic in long, gray waves of air, and it has been coming for as long as anyone has stood on this black rock to feel it. Picture a man on the cliffs of Strimoy in the year 1740, dressed in homespun wool the color of wet earth, a knitted cap pulled low, sheepskin bound to his feet with cord. Below him, the sea drops away 400 feet to a churning white line. Behind him, there are no trees. There have never been trees here, only grass, stone, sheep, and the low turf roofs of a village that clings to the land as if afraid of being blown into the ocean. This is the edge of the known world, and the people who live here did not choose it so much as they were caught inside it. The Faroe Islands are 18 fragments of volcanic rock flung into the sea between Norway, Iceland, and Scotland, closer to the Arctic Circle than to any capital that ruled them. The Norse came first in the early 9th century. The Faroese sagas name a man called Grimur Kamban as the first settler, arriving around the year 825, sailing out of the west with sheep, cattle, and the hope of land no king yet owned. What he found was a place that gave nothing freely. There was almost no soil deep enough to plow, no wood to build with, except the driftwood the currents carried from Norway and Siberia. The oldest inhabited timber house on the islands at Kirkjubur was raised from logs that had crossed an ocean before a single beam was cut. Everything here had to be dragged from somewhere else, or wrestled from the rock and the water by hand. For 1,000 years, the arithmetic of survival barely changed. The very name of the islands, Faroeyjar, means the sheep islands, and it was sheep that made life possible at all. A law written on sheepskin around the year 1298, the oldest surviving Faroes document, already regulated who could graze how many animals on which patch of mountain, because even then, there was not enough to go around. The islands could feed only so many mouths. For century after century, the population held stubbornly between 4,000 and 8,000 souls, held there not by choice, but by hunger, by disease, by the sea, and by the cold judgment of a land that would carry no more. The villages were scattered like seeds thrown by a careless hand, a cluster of houses at the head of one fjord, another beyond a mountain wall a full day's walk away, another on an island reachable only by open rowing boat across water that killed without warning. Each settlement was its own small world, and in the centuries to come, a Danish physician would count 52 of them, each so isolated that a fever entering one might not reach the next for weeks. Isolation was the first fact of Faroese life. A woman born in a village on Suðuroy might live and die without ever seeing Tórshavn, the only place large enough to be called a town, where the turf-roofed houses of Tinganes crowded onto a rocky spit, and the old assembly, the Lugting, had met in the open air since the days of the Vikings. Into this hard-closed world came a heavier hand. In 1662, the Danish crown handed the islands and all their trade to a nobleman, Christopher Gabel, and his heirs, who squeezed them for profit. Then, in 1709, King Frederick IV of Denmark took the trade directly under royal control. From that year forward, no Faroes man or woman was permitted to buy or sell anything to anyone but the king's own monopoly. Grain, timber, iron, salt, everything the islands could not grow or make, arrived on royal ships from Copenhagen, and it arrived on the king's schedule, which was twice a year, if the weather allowed and the crown remembered. Wool, dried fish, feathers, and tallow left the same way, at prices the crown alone set, always low. A fisherman could watch a Dutch or English vessel ride at anchor in his own fjord, laden with flour and cloth, and know that to row out and trade a pair of woolen stockings for a handful of grain could bring severe punishment down upon him. So, the trap closed on every side. The land would feed only a few. The sea took the strong and drowned them. The weather forbade the crops that fed the rest of Europe, and now a distant king in a warm city had claimed the right to decide what these people could eat, wear, and sell, and had priced their labor at almost nothing. The Faroes did not suffer in a single catastrophe, a single massacre, a single terrible year. They suffered slowly, across generations, in the ordinary grind of a life lived at the limit of what the human body can endure. A life of wind and salt and wet wool and hunger that never quite became famine and never quite went away. To understand what these islands cost the people who lived on them, you have to follow them off the cliff edge and down into the daily work of staying alive. The day on the Faroe Islands began in the dark and in the cold, and for most of the year, it stayed that way. The houses were low and small, walls of stone and turf packed thick against the wind, roofs of birch bark and living grass that had to be cut like a meadow. Inside, a single room held an entire family, and often their animals through the worst of winter, the heat of the beasts helping to keep the people alive. There were no chimneys in the oldest homes, only a hole in the roof through which the smoke of a peat fire found its slow way out, so that the walls and the lungs of everyone within were black with soot. When the Danish doctor Peter Ludvig Panum came to study the islands, he wrote of houses that were damp, dark, and crowded, of people whose clothes were seldom dry, and whose bodies were, in his blunt clinical phrase, thick with lice. This was not the home of the poorest. This was the ordinary house of the ordinary Faroese family. The work that kept them alive was among the most dangerous ever practiced by any settled people. On the Great Bird Cliffs, at Vestmanna, at Enneberg, where the rock rises nearly 2,000 feet straight out of the sea, on the outlying stack of mykeens, men went down after birds and eggs on ropes of woven wool and horsehair. A fowler would be lowered over the lip of the cliff into nothing, swinging on a line held by his brothers and neighbors above, and there, hanging over the white water, he would reach into the crevices for eggs or sweep a long-handled net, the flay gaston, through clouds of puffins and fulmars in flight. The most prized ledges could be reached only by swinging like a pendulum until a hand or foot caught the rock. A frayed rope, a loosened stone, a gust of wind, and a man was gone. And his body, if the sea gave it back at all, was carried home to a village where every family already knew this arithmetic by heart. Seabirds were not sport, they were food. A skilled fowler might take hundreds in a day, and those birds, salted and dried, were the difference between a family that ate through winter and one that did not. The sea offered the same bargain, sustenance in exchange for the constant risk of death. The men fished from open rowing boats, no deck, no shelter, pulling for the fishing grounds and water that could turn from gray calm to killing chaos in an hour. When a school of pilot whales was sighted, the whole district gave chase in what the Faroes called the grindadrap, driving the pod into a shallow bay to be killed with knives in the reddening water. The islands have kept records of these hunts since 1584, unbroken since 1709, and the average catch across the centuries ran to some 800 whales a year. It was a feast and a lifeline both, blubber and meat divided among every household by ancient rule. And it was also brutal, exhausting, bloody labor that a hungry people could not afford to refuse. Between the cliff and the sea lay the endless work of the sheep and the land. The grass had to be cut with short-handled scythes on slopes so steep that a man could fall to his death mowing hay. The sheep had to be driven, caught, and slaughtered on the same murderous ground. What little barley would grow was ground in stone querns by hand. And always there was the preserving, because nothing here could be wasted, and there was no salt to spare and little sun to dry by. So, the Faroes learned to hang mutton in open wooden sheds, the hjalur, letting the wet Atlantic wind cure it half-rotten into skerpikjurt, wind-dried meat, or fermented into the sour, pungent rest that outsiders could barely stomach. They ate seabird and whale and dried fish and mutton, and, in later centuries, the potato, which at last gave them something to grow. In good years, there was enough. In bad years, when the fishing failed, when the hay rotted in a wet summer, when the royal grain ship did not come, there was hunger, real and gnawing, and the old and the young felt it first. Cold was the constant companion of hunger. The Faroes' winter is not the deep freeze of the continent, but something more insidious. A wet, wind-driven cold that soaks through wool and never lets the body dry. In a house without a proper hearth, sleeping many to a bed under sheepskins, a family conserved warmth the only way they could, by pressing close together in the dark while the storm hammered the turf roof above them. Disease found such houses easily. Damp, smoke, poor food, and constant close quarters bred the coughs and fevers that carried off infants by the score. Long before any single great epidemic arrived, the ordinary illnesses of poverty were already thinning every generation. This was the daily reality, not a single wound, but 1,000 small ones, repeated every day of every year, until endurance itself became the only inheritance a pharaoh's parent had to pass down. Poverty on the Faroe Islands was not only a matter of hunger and weather. It was written into the law, into the language, into the very right to fall in love and start a family. And behind all of it stood the long shadow of the Danish crown. For 147 years, from 1709 until 1856, the royal trade monopoly governed the whole of Faroe's economic life, and it governed it for the benefit of Copenhagen, not of the islands. The monopoly fixed the price of everything the Faroes sold and everything they were allowed to buy. It kept the islands as a closed shop, a captive market, deliberately prevented from developing any trade, any industry, any wealth of their own. Historians who study the period do not soften it. The monopoly held the Faroe Islands as a poor peasant society, frozen at the level of bare subsistence for a century and a half, because a poor and dependent colony was easier to control than a prosperous one. The cruelty of the system lay in its ordinary workings. The king's ships came twice a year, and what they carried was what the islands would have. If the grain ran short, the people went hungry until the next sailing, whatever the season. To trade with the foreign vessels that passed through Faroe's waters, the Dutch buses, the English smacks, was smuggling, and smuggling was punished. A man caught rowing out to a passing ship to exchange a few knitted socks for flour could face real penalty for the crime of feeding his family by the wrong hand. The islanders smuggled anyway, quietly, along hidden inlets, because the alternative was to trust their survival entirely to a bureaucracy 1,000 miles away that regarded them as a line in a ledger. This was resistance in its most basic form, the refusal to starve on schedule. Above the economic control lay a slower, deeper erasure, the erasure of who the Faroes were. Their language, a living branch of Old Norse carried across the sea by the first settlers, was pushed steadily out of every place that mattered. The church spoke Danish. The school, when there was a school, taught in Danish. The courts, the officials, the written word, all Danish. Faroese became a tongue you spoke at home and by the fire, but could not read in a book, because for centuries it was barely written down at all. A people can lose itself this way, quietly, over generations, until its children no longer have the words for their own inheritance. And in 1816 the crown went further and abolished the Løgting itself, the ancient open-air assembly at Tinganes that had met since Viking times, the one institution that was theirs, silenced with the stroke of an administrative pen. It would not return, and then only as a powerless advisory body until 1852. Against this erasure, the Faroes held one weapon, and they held it in their memory. On winter nights, in the crowded rooms of the turf-roofed houses, they linked arms and danced. The Faroes' chain dance was unlike any other in Europe. No instruments, only the tramp of feet, and the voice of a lead singer chanting the old ballads, the kvæði, verse after verse of Norse heroes and Christian saints in island legend, the whole room answering in the refrain. These ballads, thousands of lines of them, were never written. They lived only in the mouths of the people, passed down from grandparent to grandchild across the very centuries when the printed language was Danish. In the dance, the Faroes kept their tongue alive when every official channel was closed to it. It was, in the plainest sense, a people singing itself back into existence night after night, so that it would not be forgotten. But the harshest control of all reached into the most intimate corner of life. Land on the islands was of two kinds, the freehold owned outright by a fortunate few, and the king's copyhold farmed by tenants, the rights that meant survival, a place in the village boat, a share of the whale, a section of bird cliff, a strip of grazing, flowed from the land, and the man without land had almost nothing. A servant, a laborer with no holding of his own, was in practice forbidden to marry and establish a household, because there was no place for a new family to draw its living from. Whole lives were spent in service on another man's farm, unmarried, childless, dependent, the years passing without the ordinary human hope of a home and children of one's own. Poverty here did not merely make life hard, it reached in and denied people the future itself, the right to become the parents and the elders of the next generation. And so, the young who could not make a life on the islands began, in the closing decades of the 19th century, to leave for the fishing seasons in Iceland, a summer migration the Faroes called Fara til lands, to go to the land, a name that admitted a bitter truth, that the land of their birth had, for too many, become a place with no room left to hold them. In the end, every hardship of these islands fell hardest on the ones least able to bear it, the child at the breast, the old woman by the fire, the sick who could not rise. And in the year 1846, the Faroe Islands endured the event that gathered all their vulnerability into a single, meticulously recorded catastrophe. In the spring of that year, a Danish cabinet maker returned home from Copenhagen, carrying, without knowing it, the measles. The disease had not touched the islands in 65 years, not since 1781, and in that long silence, an entire population had grown up with no immunity whatsoever. When measles landed on these people, it did not behave as it did in the cities of Europe, where it culled mainly the very young. Here, it swept through every age alike, and it fell with terrible weight on grown men and women, on nursing mothers, and the strong laborers a family depended on. The Danish government sent a newly qualified physician, Peter Ludvig Panum, just 26 years old, together with a colleague, to fight the outbreak and to study it. What Panum found and wrote down became one of the founding documents of modern epidemiology, and it is also one of the most exact records of mass suffering the 19th century has left us. Of roughly 7,782 people living on the islands, some 6,000 fell ill. About 170 died. Panum himself treated close to 1,000 patients, traveling by boat and on foot between the scattered villages, watching the fever move from house to house across water and mountain. Because the settlements were so isolated, he could trace the disease village by village, 52 separate outbreaks, each a small tragedy of its own. And it was precisely this island geography of misery that let him uncover the hidden laws of contagion, the incubation period, the lifelong immunity of the aged few who had survived the epidemic of 1781, and now, alone among their neighbors, did not sicken. Behind Panum's clean statistics lay scenes of ordinary horror. In a one-room turf house at the head of some fjord, an entire family might lie ill at once, no one well enough to fetch water or tend the fire, the sheep unmilked, the peat unburned, the cold seeping in. A nursing mother struck down could not feed her infant, and the infant died not always of the disease, but of the neglect the disease forced upon it. The old, who in a normal winter were kept alive by the care of the young, found that care withdrawn when the young themselves were burning with fever. On islands where the nearest doctor might be days away by open boat, most of the sick were tended by no one but the equally sick. Panum, moving among them, recorded the reserve and the exhaustion of a people who had learned across long centuries to meet catastrophe with a kind of grim, wordless endurance, because complaint had never once changed the outcome. And the dead were buried as they had always been buried, in the small stone-walled churchyards beside the black timber churches, in graves dug into the thin soil, the whole village gathered in the wind, while the pastor read in Danish over a Faroe's grave. Child mortality on the islands had always been high. In the ordinary run of years, a mother might bear 8 children and stand at the graves of half of them. The measles year only concentrated into a few months a grief that these communities knew in every generation. There was no monument to it, no memorial beyond the parish register and Panum's report. The suffering of the Faroe Islands was never the kind that raised statues. It was the suffering of small places, endured by ordinary people, remembered, if at all, only in a ballad, a name in a church book, a family that ended when its last child was laid in the ground. 10 years after the measles, in 1856, the Danish crown at last abolished the trade monopoly. Almost at once the islands began to change. Faroese merchants bought decked fishing vessels, sailed to the deep grounds off Iceland and Greenland, and built at last an economy of their own, Cade becoming the engine that carried the islands out of medieval poverty. The population, held down for 1,000 years, finally began to climb, 8,000 at mid-century, 15,000 by 1900. A scholar named Hammersheimb gave the spoken language a written form. In 1846, the same year as the measles, the work of preserving the old ballads had already begun. 20 years later, the first Faroese newspaper appeared, and a people that had been sung into survival began to write itself into the future. But the centuries of suffering that came before were not erased by the prosperity that followed. They were the foundation of it. Everything the Faroes became, their fierce attachment to their own tongue, their communal sharing of the whale and the harvest, their unsentimental endurance in the face of a sea that still takes their sons, was forged in 1,000 years of hardship at the edge of the habitable world. Here is the larger truth these islands hold up to us, that whole peoples have lived and suffered and held on to their humanity in places the powerful of the earth barely troubled to remember, ruled from far away, priced at almost nothing, counted only when a fever made them worth studying. The Faroes survived not because they were spared, but because they refused, generation after generation, to be blown off the rock into the sea. And in that refusal, stubborn, wordless, unrewarded, there is something that outlasts every empire that ever set a price on a poor man's labor and called it order.